Hello and welcome to Let's Review. This week, I'm afraid I didn't have sufficient time to get a proper Let's Play recorded. My apologies for that. On the plus side, it's not like anything important came out recently. Well, there was the release of a new Sakura game. I hate you so much. Regardless, for this week, I decided I would do something a little bit different. So this is a list of 6 things that don't have video game adaptations, but that really should. Some of them are a bit more obvious than others, so I'll just be skimming them, and some of them I want to go into a bit more detail about specific ideas that I personally have had. Incidentally, if something I mentioned does have a game adaptation, it still counts as part of this list because it's either obscure enough that I haven't heard of it, or it's terrible enough that I've chosen to blank it from my memory. With that said, let's just get on with the list and start with a really obvious one. Number 1. Stargate. How in the hell does Stargate not have a video game adaptation yet? Let's face it, to the best of my knowledge there have been quite a few attempts to make one, but none of them ever seems to have got out of the initial trailer phase. And I just don't get why. The Stargate universe is full of a hell of a lot of interesting enemies. It's got modern day military, so you've got a serious potential for an FPS right there. And it's got enough variety in their enemies to give you a lot of enemy variety in a game, especially once you factor in Atlantis. At the end of the day, I suspect it's one of these things that comes down to a rights issue, but I would really love to see a video game set in the Stargate universe. Just not Stargate universe because, well, that would be really kind of boring. Number 2. Babylon 5. Okay, I know I've covered a Babylon 5 game on this very show, but fan-made games don't count. No offense, makers of I Found Out, I happen to really like your game. But all it did was remind me that with a proper budget, we could have one hell of a Babylon 5 themed space combat game. And hell, use it as a follow-up to Crusade. Let's see how the hell that was supposed to end. There are all kinds of interesting things you could do with the Babylon 5 universe. And since space combat games kind of died out, and now seem to be coming back, what with the whole Star Citizen raising more money than God thing, I think, quite frankly, it will be really interesting to see. Number 3. Eragon. I know, there is an Eragon video game, but since it's based off the terrible film adaptation, I am choosing not to count it. You seem to be bending your own rules rather a lot. Yes, but I promise that this is the last time, okay? I got talked into reading the Eragon books by my housemate at university. He actually bought me the first 3 books in a charity shop for, I think, about £6. And they are fine. They are perfectly functional fantasy books. They're nothing amazing, but they're an enjoyable enough read. And I think they're ripe for adaptation. And I would honestly look to the Witcher series as an inspiration, in that you don't want to try and directly adapt one of the books because, well, let's face it, that never works. But instead, you do a follow-up. Fairly massive spoilers for the books incoming, by the way. Does anyone care about that? Some people might. At the end of the series, Eragon and his dragon Saphira leave the continent to go and found a new home for the Dragon Riders, leaving behind a collection of eggs that will only hatch when the dragon finds the person who is to be their rider. As a result, I would then say, skip ahead a few decades, let the order be partially restored, and make our character a brand new rider, and let us customize both them and their dragon. This, to me, has all the makings of a really interesting open-world RPG, as you explore the bond between both the rider and their dragon, fully voice them both, let them get fleshed out as characters in their own right, and let's just play with this relationship between these 2 characters. You give them a new enemy to fight, you give them a reason to pootle around the world, and just an excuse to fly around on the back of a dragon, because, let's face it, the most interesting thing about the series is the idea of these people who are telepathically bonded to these dragons and just flying around on the back of them being awesome, because let's face it, riding dragons is really damn cool.
Number 4. Andromeda.
Andromeda was a sci-fi series that I think started really well. I happen to really like the first 2 seasons. Unfortunately, after about the middle of season 3, it bombed horribly and just became almost unwatchably terrible, but regardless, it has one thing about it that makes me really want a space-based RTS set in its universe. Freaking gorgeous ship designs.
Is that really sufficient justification for the creation of a game?
No, but this is a wish list, not a practical list. Look, the ship designs in Andromeda, and especially the Andromeda Ascendant herself, are absolutely gorgeous. And given the scale of the war that effectively kicks off the series, you could do some pretty epic space battles in a properly themed space-based RTS. Now, granted, in order to keep in context with series canon, you would have to have the good guys effectively lose that war, but at the same time you could tell some really interesting stories within it, and the last mission could be effectively the glorious last stand of the system's Commonwealth. And to my mind, it would be totally worth it to see fleets and fleets of glorious Heritage-class cruisers flying around, because, oh my god, are those things beautiful.
Number 5. The Lost Fleet.
The Lost Fleet books are really good. If you've never heard them, I genuinely recommend you look them up and give them a read. But they're basically about a fleet of warships trapped deep behind enemy lines during an extremely long-running war, trying to find their way home. This one I see very much like FTL, but on a far larger scale. Rather than just commanding one ship, you have a massive fleet at your command. And the more ships you get through each battle, the greater the strain on your resources becomes. Do you need to keep your destroyer and cruiser screens as manned as you can, or are you going to need their fuel reserves to keep your battle cruisers mobile in the next fight? You add to that branching paths home, and I think you could do something really interesting here. I'm not sure if I actually want a direct adaptation of the books, or just something that uses a lot of the same ideas, but I really think you could do something very interesting with a lot of the premises here.
Number 6. The Dresden Files.
The Dresden Files books are really good, telling the story of the only man in Chicago listed in the phone book under wizards. In a lot of ways, they are actually very much classic hard-boiled detective stories, just with magic thrown in. And as a result, I think they'd be a really good fit for what we can dub the Telltale model. Lots of talking, figuring things out, hunting for clues, solving the mysteries, with the occasional action sequence where you throw around blasts of force or gouts of fire. And as with Eragon, I wouldn't recommend trying to adapt any specific book in the series, but instead I'd recommend creating a new story that's meant to be one of the cases that he handles in between books.
Would that not by necessity be less interesting?
No. Smaller, certainly, but there's no reason why a smaller case has to be less interesting. Especially if we bring in a lot of the supporting cast. You've got Karen Murphy, Molly, Michael, Bob, Thomas. All of these are really interesting characters, and I'd love a chance to interact with them, talk to them, and flesh them out even more than they are in the books. The books themselves have some really fascinating lore, and frankly, it's a world that I'd really love to play with. This underworld of Chicago that's full of monsters as well as crooks is actually a really interesting idea, and the books have handled it really well. And I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't have put this on this list if Telltale hadn't already proved that they can do something similar with The Wolf Among Us.
Would that not simply be retreading the same ground then?
Maybe, but there's nothing wrong with adapting similar material, provided you do something interesting with it. The Dresden Files books are really good, and if you haven't read them, do. And in the meantime, I just hope that somebody gives us a really interesting video game adaptation. And that is it for my list. Half a dozen things that I think would make for pretty interesting video games in a variety of genres. Do you have your own suggestions? leave them in the comments. I'd love to read them. Now, if you'll excuse me, I kind of feel like marathoning the first couple of seasons of Andromeda. I'll see you later.